Hello, I think I'm live. Welcome to the Roguelike Celebration Preview event. Trying to talk to all you lovely folks in chat, having some technical issues on that end myself, but I am here, and you're here, even if I can't currently see your messages. We are here to stress test the space and get excited for Roguelike Celebration, which we are doing already. Appreciate that. And yeah, it's really wonderful to have everyone back again. And especially for the preview event, this is really helpful for us. The main purpose on our side is that this is a way that we can test out the social space ahead of time. And so if you do run into any bugs, we would really appreciate if you report them. What you can do in the social space is tap /mod, M-O-D, and describe the issue, and that will send a report to all of us on the organizing team, which would be great. The other thing that you can do is that if you explore the space, you'll find that there is a feedback kiosk located near the fountain, which, as you can see, we have a fresh coat of paint on the social space. So go ahead and also check that out if you'd like. That is a place where at the feedback kiosk, you can leave feedback on the space as well as any other kind of reports. There'll be some time to do that after all of our talks and content for today is done. We're going to have a little bit of time for speaker breakout discussions and also to wander the space. So that's a time when you can go leave your feedback. So let's see, going through things here before we get into the exciting stuff. For people who might not have been here before, there is a code of conduct. It's on our website. There's also a link to it on the left side of the screen. Please make sure to give that a look. We do have moderators in the space. You can message them with that /mod command, or you can see people who have a hammer icon are moderators in space. So please go ahead and let us know if you have any problems at all. And, you know, be considerate, treat each other like real people, because we are real people hanging out here together. And I will say, you might be watching this on Twitch or on YouTube and wonder what I'm talking about with the social space and all that jazz. Well, there is a whole place where we're talking to each other and where you can submit questions, and it is not too late to join in. If you go to roguelike.club, you could still get a free ticket, and that will give you a link to get into the social space where you can hang out and ask questions. While you're there, why not check out the tickets for the main event in October? That'll be October 21st and 22nd, where we'll have tons of great talks versus today, where we have a few great talks, but it'll be 2 whole days of roguelike amazingness. We already have the list of speakers and talks up on the website, so you can check that out. We'll have a schedule coming shortly, and if you want to know about the schedule as soon as it's put together, make sure you're on our newsletter. If you're not already, we send out updates there. And yeah, it's going to be really exciting, and you can get your ticket right now. If, while you're experiencing the social space, as a vice versa, things go catastrophically wrong and you somehow can no longer access it, don't worry. You can't talk to people, which is unfortunate, but there is a Twitch stream and there is a YouTube stream going live right now as well. So you can always go and watch the talks there if the social space isn't working for you. We do know one main thing is that Chrome tends to be best supported. I will say, social space, everything entirely made by volunteers, entirely open source. If you want to help us out with making it better, then please get in touch with us. We're happy to get all the help from anyone who's interested. You can check out our schedule on the left-hand sidebar or on the website. For the fireside talks in particular, make sure to take advantage of the fact that if you're in the theater, there's a write a question button. You click that, it's going to bring up a list of questions. You can upvote them. You can submit questions. I'll be reading those live as we're doing the fireside chats and getting to as many questions as I can. And for Nic's talk in the middle of the day, we might have time for 1 or 2 questions. So go ahead and check that out. I'll be keeping an eye on it. I want to say thank you right up front to Maggie, who's our live captioner today and has been year after year. Super appreciate you, Maggie. And also to Kristen, who is the overlay artist that we still use all these great little overlays all around me on the screen. So that was a quick little run through because I wanted to make sure to cover everything before we get into having our first guess of the day, which I believe I wrapped up just in time, have I not? I think that it is. Does it start now? I did. Okay. Well, then, I am excited to just jump right into our first fireside chat with David Brevik, 32-year-old veteran game developer, best known for being president of Blizzard North, creating groundbreaking games such as Diablo and Diablo 2. His lengthy career includes creating Hellgate London, Marvel Heroes, It Lurks Below, and many other titles. Currently president of Skystone Games, as well as being a VC advisor and creative director. Welcome, David.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Yeah, it is really nice to have you at our little roguelike conference.
It's fun.
Yeah, it's very nice for you to come and talk about the roguelikes, especially, we, of course, very interested in Diablo 1 and the roguelike influence. I have heard it said that we should perhaps call live action Diablo-likes instead of roguelikes.
Yeah, maybe. I think that when Diablo first came out, nobody knew what to call it. So it's been named all sorts of things all along. It's been many different iterations of it was a little bit like, chocolate and peanut butter kind of thing. You put your chocolate in my peanut butter, you put my peanut butter in your chocolate. They didn't really, is this an RPG or is this an action game? Or is this what is this? I don't even understand. So maybe that Diablo has gone to be an influence for a lot of other games too. So I don't know. It's all become a mishmash now.
Yeah, I guess at the time, how much was roguelike even a term that you could be throwing around in marketing generally? Who would know what that was?
I mean, some people knew what rogue was, but I don't think the term roguelike even existed back then.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I guess, getting right into it, I know that we sometimes have very specific roguelike questions for this conference. I know one thing that came up is it seems like Angband in particular is kind of a lineage there. I know I've heard that you played a variety of kind of roguelikes in college. With something like Angband, were there any particular touchstones for influences, or was it just kind of everything that was out at the time?
Well, that was definitely a huge influence on the design. When I started making Diablo, I started designing it in high school and started working on it. And it was originally kind of a party-based game that was similar to the other kind of party-based games at the time. There was started out with wizardry and might and magic and Bard's Tale and all a zillion types of RPGs like that. But then when I went to college, I started playing a bunch of rogue and roguelike games, and Moria and Rogue and some others were really big influences on the design, and I found myself in the computer lab playing them hour after hour after hour, and then when Moria came out, then I kind of switched to that, which later became Angband, and that was really a huge influence on what I wanted to do. So when we left, when I graduated from college, then the next thing was eventually I was going to make this Diablo game, but it had radically shifted from this party-based thing to being, well, kind of like a roguelike. But we wanted to do some other stuff, but that was the big kind of theory about what we were going to make.
Right, yeah, and I heard that the first iteration of Diablo was closer. There were a lot more of these mechanics, more single-player, turn-based, even permadeath. So what was it like moving away from that and, making the decisions of where to drop some of that and where to keep those roguelike elements? Because obviously it worked out pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah, it worked out just fine. But in fact, I was really against the changes. When we pitched Diablo, it was turn-based. In fact, you can find the original Diablo pitch document that we sent out to, and gave to people at shows and stuff. And the original pitch document is on my Graybeard Games, that's gray with an A, graybeardgames.com website. You can go there. You can download the PDF of the original Diablo pitch. It talks about it being turn-based and permadeath and things like that. And so we had started out really kind of wanting to make that turn-based game, but it wasn't going to be kind of simple my turn your turn kind of turn-based. It was going to be turn-based with kind of like a points system. So this particular move takes, moving left or right or up or down takes 10 points, and moving diagonally takes 14 points, and things like that. So it was like kind of like time segments, or whatever you want to think of it as. So it was like the order would constantly change. It wasn't just a my turn your turn thing. And we started making that, and that was the intent with Diablo. And then about, I don't know, about 5 or so months into development, the guys, Blizzard was originally two separate independent developers. We were a development team called Condor, and the development team down south was we're in Northern California, and they're in Southern California. They were called Silicon and Synapse. And then when they got bought, they changed their name to Blizzard. We got bought, we became Blizzard North, but we were two kind of separate companies, but we shared kind of the Blizzard label and helped each other out tremendously. They did a lot of stuff. Once we were acquired, they did a tremendous amount of things for us, and we really kind of more merged into one company. But they called us up and said, "Hey, well, what do you think about changing this to real time instead of turn-based?" I was like, "God, no way do I want to do
Just
that."
a small
way.
suggestion.
Yeah, exactly. And I was just adamant. I was like, there is no way I want to do that. It will ruin everything. And for me, the turn-based and stuff was really the tension in a roguelike game. You're going around and you're like kind of getting a little bit lazy because it gets a little easy, and then you come around a corner and then all of a sudden you get hit by, there's a ancient multi-hued dragon that just came out of nowhere or something like that, and I'm really screwed now. And so
death by boredom. I've seen it called.
Yeah, exactly. It's
making the foolish mistakes.
Yeah, and then the palms are sweating, and you're like, "Oh my God, I'm going to lose this character. What am I going to do? I've spent 3 weeks on this thing, and like, this is just a disaster. I don't know how to get out of this. What the hell's in my backpack? There's got to be something to help me out here, so I was like, I don't want to lose that tension. Like, that is really the key to making that game work. And they said, "Well, yeah, about that, we don't want it permadeath either." Oh my God. Oh my God. No, that's ridiculous. And then, and so like, I hung up the phone and went around the office, and I started talking about this with a few people or whatever. And like, can you believe the outrage of them wanting to turn this thing into real time or whatever? And then like a couple days go by, and then people approach me and they're like, "Yeah, we all want to turn it to real time. We don't want it to be turn-based." And I'm like, "Oh man." And so like I held out. I did all we can, and eventually it came down to a vote, and there was about, I don't know, maybe 15, 17 people, something like that, around that in the company at the time. We all gathered together in the kitchen. We had a vote, and about 4 of us wanted to keep it turn-based, and everybody else wanted to change it to real time. So we ended up giving it a try, and the moment that I tried it, I knew that it was actually the right decision for this game, for the market at the time, and things like that. It was like, this is obviously something new and really, really great. And so though it was a decision I didn't want and didn't take lightly, in the end, I was really glad that we did it.
Yeah, that's great. Do you think that is still kind of a design sensibility you've moved forward with in your career of, if you're not sure, like getting that prototype and kind of feeling it and seeing it and kind of going
absolutely
with that?
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm very into prototypes. I still make tons of prototypes. I still program almost every day. And I make prototypes of all sorts of different things. I'll have ideas and I'll prototype things, and sometimes I'll use them and a project. Sometimes I'll just put them on the shelf for later kind of thing. But I'm constantly prototyping stuff to see how it works. Even in products where, we're big budget projects, we're prototyping stuff all the time, just to see, hey, this theory sounds okay, but what does it really play like? And so that, and being the cool part about prototypes is that, you don't put a whole bunch of effort into it. So like if it's throwaway, then it's like, okay, well, that didn't work, but let's move on. And that's how I felt really about the prototype of turning the game Diablo from turn-based to real-time. When they suggested it, I was like, oh, this is going to take so long to change it in. Because we were the world's worst businessmen when we made this. We originally signed the deal to do Diablo for I don't remember, like $300,000 or something like that for the whole development of the game. And it was the math doesn't even work out. And so we were desperate for more money or whatever, because we had totally blown it. And so I was like, oh, it's going to take an extra milestone. It'll take us months to do this and all this kind of stuff. And they're like, okay, yeah. So they ended up giving us a little bit more money. Eventually they ended up acquiring us. And so that all went away, which was great. The stress of that situation. But but it was like, oh, it's going to take forever. It's going to take forever. And then I started on a Friday. We sent everybody home for the weekend. And I was like, okay, because nobody could do anything while I made this big, gigantic change to the project or whatever. And so, and I had it running that afternoon. So there was in one, I don't know, in 6 hours or 8 hours or whatever it was I had it running. And you could still call it kind of prototypey, but it was obvious enough to know right away that this was something that you could play and you could feel what it was going to be like. And so even if it had not worked out, it was not going to be a giant waste of time.
Yeah, getting there quick. Laser Walker in chat asks, what kind of stuff are you prototyping today? Is there anything fun you can mention? Like you said, you're still doing it to this day.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I don't know if I can share all of my stuff that I prototype, but I think that the thing I've been prototyping the most lately is it's a very different kind of offering for me, is a puzzle roguelike game. So I've been doing a lot of prototyping with that.
Well, that's exciting. That will be relevant to this audience for sure. Yeah, and that actually, talking about real time on the prototyping relates. We had a submitted question about that transition of figuring out what's that minimum viable rule set to get to real time out of turn based, and keeping some of that flexibility, and how much you have to change the rules. If you can keep the rules flexible enough that you don't have to throw away the work, that it kind of applies to real time, applies to turn based. Do you have any thoughts there? How do you start bridging that gap?
Well, for us, luckily, we had designed the thing so that it was this move takes 10 to move sideways, 14 to move diagonally, kind of. I just turned those into fractions of a second, and then said, okay, well, it's going to take 1.4 seconds for you to move diagonally and 1 second to move, orthogonally. And it was like, okay, well, that, things like that were pretty easy to kind of instantly, oh, I'm going to run basically 10 turns a second or whatever and see what that's like. And it didn't take very long for me to kind of prototype that. And then I could tweak the numbers, set it up so I could change them and things like that. And I had the prototype running pretty quickly. I just basically took a bunch of turns a second and then merged a lot of the data that we had already set up to kind of run in real time. There were some changes that I needed to do in terms of your turn, monster's turn, and they were going at the same time and things like that. But it wasn't really a massive amount of work. A lot of the kind of data and things like that underneath were still kind of applied. So that helped a ton.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I know that, I found it interesting looking under the hood because of the open sourceness of games like NetHack. They have a whole kind of action cost system that's even how their turn-based works. So yeah, that's really interesting that, the numbers let you convert that back and forth.
The source code for Diablo got reverse engineered. The story on that was pretty crazy. Eventually somebody somehow cracked the encryption for PlayStation 1. And
Ah.
so the PlayStation 1, we made Diablo for PlayStation 1, only we didn't make it. We had a separate developer made it. We just kind of oversaw it. We were working on Diablo 2 at the time. And so we hired somebody to port Diablo to the console. And so they had like made it and, burnt came out but they had taken it, and when they made the image for the CD-ROM for the PlayStation, which was encrypted, so they thought it was safe, they put the symbol table in the things to be encrypted onto the disc. So when they hacked and cracked the PlayStation thing, people looked at the discs and they found the symbol table for Diablo, and then reverse, engineered the whole thing, disassembled it, and then had the symbol table, and were able to kind of reverse engineer the code. Anyway, interesting thing. So the Diablo 1 source is out there in kind of cracked form somewhere.
Well, that's good to know. I'm sure no one here will do anything.
It's crazy some of the things I've seen people do with that. Like they've shown me, I got it running on a phone, and I got like at the end of it's pretty crazy what they've done with it.
Oh, that's great. Another question. So, really specifically, even the kind of walking speed, because another point that comes up is the transition of the original Diablo quite a bit closer to roguelike, still is kind of a slower pace, and then as they go on, they get more actiony and get further from that. When did that come from? Because I know you worked on Diablo 2 as well, of that decision to start speeding up, making it more actiony. How much of that was intentional choices you went on, and how much of that was just when you were working on Diablo 1 of like, well, how far did you have time to push it, at a certain point? Like, would you have wanted to make Diablo 1 as fast-paced as Diablo 2? Or, did you do each one intentionally and decide to step that out?
Right. I think that Diablo 1 was slow-paced, and I thought that it was right for the project. I liked how slow it was. But it was still kind of a large grid based project. Like it was very much like making any kind of like ASCII roguelike or whatever, where it's like I generated the dungeons by hand. Like I came up with different algorithms to make the different layouts, and then I would convert the layouts, which were like, hey, there's a floor and a wall and a door and things like that, using this really complicated system that would convert that stuff into the graphics for the level. And it was all hand done for each tile set. Each tile set had a different algorithm, had a different conversion process, had different tiles that had to like be substituted in and stuff. It was a total nightmare. And so because that was like on this kind of like big grid, that kind of dictated the entire way that the game played. Like you couldn't stop, you had to go move from tile to tile on a big kind of grid. And so you could only be surrounded by 8 things. And, there was like the limits were very, very different. And when we made Diablo 2, we decided, well, we're going to make and here's a kind of a dumb decision we did, but this is what we went with. We went with a 5x5 grid. We took one of those tiles and we broke it down into 5x5 little micro grids. And so and then you had kind of different shapes that like really small monsters could just take up 1 square. You kind of took up like a little cross shape. Things like that were kind of, and so that allowed you to be surrounded by more things, have like much more flexibility in pathing, and appear much smoother. We also went with 16 direction movement instead of 8, and the animations and stuff like that, the different visuals. So there were a bunch of things that we did to kind of like change the fidelity of actual movement in the universe, and that made a huge change in actually the pace. Then there was also that combined with the fact that the number one complaint that we got was the walk when you were in town from coming out of the dungeon out to the witch or whatever to get potions was like this long ass walk, and it's like it took 30 or 40 seconds to get out there. And people were like, oh my God, I wish this game had running. So then we put running in, and we're like, oh my God, this is so cool. This is really fast. I really like the running. But then we're like, well, we can't just have people running. So let's put it in a stamina bar to make sure that they can't run all the time, which was also a really terrible decision. Anyway, so kind of long story long there. It was like kind of a bunch of micro decisions, I think, that made movement a much more fluid thing, made the possibilities of the where you moved and where you stopped and how you could get surrounded and that kind of stuff, combined with speed, the fact that you could run, really kind of upped our game. And once you could run, then we had to have monsters that were just as fast. And so like the whole thing, like, it escalated in speed because of these kind of like micro decisions.
That's fascinating. The whole action-y, faster gameplay kind of boils down to just it was annoying to spend 30 seconds walking across the
Yes,
town.
absolutely. Exactly.
Game development. Wonderful.
Yes.
That's really cool. Yeah, and continuing kind of with some of these like deep divey questions, another thing that came up is when it comes to stuff like classes and item sets, because original Diablo, your starting class choice doesn't impact a whole lot, your initial attributes and things like that, but you can kind of build the build as you go, and you can use different items. And then Diablo 2, you get skill trees, and then as it goes on, you start to get item sets, so that you're not just looking at mix and match everything individually. What was kind of like your thoughts about that shift and how it impacted things as you got closer and closer to the idea of kind of builds being a big focus of the Diablo series?
Right. Well, one of the things that we wanted to do when we set out to make Diablo was to make basically the anti-RPG at the time. It was like so many RPGs were like, oh, this is about elves and dwarves and dragons and fairies and things like that. And we're just like, we're not doing any of that. And we're going to make a bunch of scary monsters, and it's going to be creepy as hell. And it's going to be dark, and it's going to be, and so some of that stemmed to the logic of the classes. Okay, we've got a few meta classes or whatever, but it doesn't make any sense that like I'm a person, like I can pick up a sword and I can swing it. I might suck at it. Like I'm not as good as like somebody that's trained. So if you want to be trained at it, you can be a warrior. But if you're not trained at it, you can still do it. You just aren't very good at it. And so that was kind of the theory behind the character classes when we made them Diablo 1, is like anybody can do anything. Whether or not you're good at it, like your casting animations might be a lot slower than, or faster depending on your class, or your attack animations and things like that. So it was like kind of balanced it out. In theory, it was supposed to be that anybody could do anything, but you just were bad at some stuff and better at some other things. So it's best to focus on the good things. However, what that made was just a giant soup where nobody knew what to do. And so,
right.
As
a criticism of some roguelikes, perhaps.
Yeah, and as an average consumer that's just like kind of picking up a game or whatever, it's like they didn't know what the hell they were supposed to be doing. They didn't quite understand the direction they were going in. And so that in Diablo 2, we were like, okay, we've got to guide people much better. And restrict people in many ways. It wasn't impossible to do some of the things, but it was like, it's just going to be a lot easier to use a bow because you're going to have the dexterity and strength required or whatever if you're playing the Amazon. But if you're not, you can still do it maybe, but it's not going to be as good. But it's like that's not really what you're supposed to be doing. And so like helping them with better skill design, and then making the choices of, hey, I want to be an Amazon, but look, there's a bunch of different types of ways that I can go with that. I can use bows, I can use spears. Like there's like, oh, this is different ways to play that particular character class. Narrowed it down a lot for people, and it made them focus on particular things in general. Then eventually things like sets and stuff allowed us to incorporate, new ideas and put twists on everything that we had done so far, as kind of a late game kind of experience where people were like, oh, we can get these particular items, we can craft it, we can make this super powerful combination with these other skills. you know, a lot of different combinations could come out of that. And we found that really exciting to kind of twist the gameplay at the end.
Yeah, that's really interesting how much of it comes partly from that, marketability and then also just understandability of like Diablo
Right.
was reaching a bigger audience than a lot of roguelikes were. And so, that leads to needing to, have some balance there. But, I think nowadays, modern games, you see a lot of roguelites and you see a lot of these roguelike elements coming into modern
Yeah.
games, and you see these balances like meta progression. I'm curious, hypothetically now looking at all of the kind of ways that roguelikes have blended with the mainstream, are there any different paths you could see yourself taking, if you were back at Diablo 1 thinking about how to make it more approachable?
Sure, absolutely. You know, but hindsight's 2020.
Yeah.
Game design has changed so much in the whatever 30 years almost since Diablo, that it's not really. I mean, we started working on Diablo in '94, so like almost exactly 30 years ago, we started working on it. And so it was. There's so many ways that games have become much more sophisticated, and the internet was kind of like brand new back then and things like that. There was just lots of things about it that are just so different. Right now you've got like streaming and with Twitch and YouTube and things like that. You have communities in Discord that with real-time chat. You've got like unprecedented access to the devs and stuff, and it's really kind of a great time in many ways. Can be great, can also be grueling and terrible, especially if you screw something up, because you'll definitely get an earful. But it's really kind of fun to have a community that's really supportive and being able to do stuff together and whatnot. Kind of creates new ways to kind of create products and stuff, and kind of make games better and better, have wider audiences, have even making games, because of the gaming business is so huge now and there's so many people playing games. You can even make niche games that are just, hey, I'm going to make this particular game and it can still be successful, even though the audience isn't huge, like it isn't like a AAA kind of product, but it can find an audience because there are so many people that are kind of dedicated to these little micro parts of gaming.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And I mean, I was going to ask if you had any kind of words of advice or anything to roguelike developers now, or kind of designers in the space, since you've been, designing in it for quite a long time and, have kind of come back to that now and then. It sounds like that was a lot of the words of wisdom of kind of leaning on that community and, the connectedness and the breadth of games these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so important. I think some of the biggest things are like, make sure that you kind of have a vision for your product, but don't be so rigid that you are going in there blindly, like, thinking that this is the way it has to be. If you're getting a bunch of comments saying, I don't like this, and you're like, yeah, but that's the way it's got to be. That's like, you got to be asking yourself, is it really the way that it's got to be? Anyway, things like that. It's the, making sure that you are getting the feedback, participating with people that you trust and understand and you believe can give you good advice. Involve them in your community, get some feedback on what you're doing, and make the product better. I mean, I learned that lesson early, changing the game from turn-based to real-time in Diablo. I listened to the outside, I gave it a try, and sure enough, it was better. It was the right decision. And so never be afraid to make changes in what your grand vision was, because almost always your end product will not be exactly the way you imagined it. Whenever you started working on it, it'll almost always change and evolve over time.
Yeah, I think that's great. And that's, there's that kind of humility in it too, of being willing to be outvoted and see what happens if you try something
I don't
different.
have all the answers. The smartest person in the room isn't the person that has all the answers. It's the person that listens to everybody.
Excellent. Oh man, I think that's a good enough nugget of wisdom that we should end on that, because I think that's
All
wonderful.
right.
I mean, thank you so much for coming and being part of this. It was really exciting to talk about. It's great because I think Diablo has an interesting role in the history of roguelikes, even if we don't call them Diablo-likes. So thank you for sharing
Thanks
some
so much for having
stories
me. It was
from,
super fun, and it was a pleasure talking with you, and have a good celebration.
Thank you so much. All right. Excellent. Well, that was very exciting. I have to say, I learned a lot about Diablo in the process, and yeah, I love it. I know that we are having some technical things that we're working through in the social space. I have still not been able to see all of you wonderful people in chat, so apologies for not answering anything you might have been saying to me. I have been seeing the note ball questions though, so please do keep using those. I believe that we have just a little bit of time here before we lead into our next speaker. So as some reminders, and also I will say if there's any updates on the social space that I should be sharing, fellow organizers, please tell me. But we will be doing breakout discussions at the end of the day, which I mentioned at the start. So for people who might not have been around before, the way that works is that in the theater, there are some adjacent rooms named after films. And at the end of all of the talks, I will be assigning a room to each topic. And then if you want to talk more about that, you can go hang out in that room. So it's a place to kind of have some follow-up discussions. If the speakers are still around, they go hang out there. But even if not, then you can meet other people who are interested in talking about that. And please do keep using the theater to submit questions. Like I said at the start, I think that we'll probably have time for maybe one or two at the end of Nic's talk. We'll see. But we will definitely be keeping an eye on questions for our last event of the day, which will be a discussion with two developers of Against the Storm, a city builder roguelike that's taken up a lot of my time lately. It's a lot of fun. So please go ahead and ask questions there. If you are watching this on Twitch or YouTube and you don't know what I'm talking about with the theater and such like that, you can still go to roguelike.club and get a free ticket to the preview event. That will give you a link to join the social space, which is kind of a web browser thing where you can talk to other attendees and you can put up questions. If you're having issues with the space, feel free to report them. Use /mod, M-O-D, and we appreciate that. Obviously, things could be a little bit rough, but the point of this preview event for us, other than just having an excuse to have more great roguelike conversations, is this gives us feedback on the space so we can try and make sure that we iron out all the issues for the main event in October, which make sure to get your tickets for the main event in October. It's going to be great. We've got original developers of NetHack, people. This is my personal holy grail of roguelike celebration topics, so I'm very excited to share it with everyone. Let's see here. It looks like I probably don't have any other things that I need to talk about, which is good. Like I said, at the end is also the time to explore the space. We have a feedback kiosk where you can leave information that might not be technically a bug report, but just feedback on the space. We're working on it right now to make it fun and fresh to explore every year. And yeah, I think barring anything else, given that I sadly cannot engage with Patter with all you lovely folks quite yet, I think that, okay. Just keeping an eye on things. Looks like there will be some issues in the social space, but that we are working on them. If there are any updates to that, I will share them with you. Thank you for our cooperation. This is an organizer group entirely of volunteers, and we do our best here. But in lieu of anything else to discuss, Kawa, wonderful, lovely backend, should we be just starting Nic's talk? I guess I can introduce Nic as we pull that up. Let me see here. So next up, we are going to have Nic Junius talking about play as in stage play, designing dynamic narrative moments through character acting. Nic's an independent game developer and PhD candidate in computational media at UC Santa Cruz, one of the favorite institutions of roguelike celebration, home of many speakers. And There, Nic is developing digital acting systems for game characters. Their background as a playwright has led them to draw heavily from experience with theatrical productions, and in particular acting practices, to build systems that enable players and NPCs to perform and interpret scenes together. So we can go ahead and play that talk. Nic will be around, hopefully, for discussion.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nic. Hi, everyone. I'm Nic, and I'm going to be talking about ways of using theater in system design, as well as why you would want to even do such a thing. First, I will start with a little bit about myself. I am a PhD candidate at UC Santa Cruz in the computational media department, working in the interaction dynamics lab, where I research character AI and design character AI and build and study interactive narrative systems. I am also an indie game developer. I make a mix of text-based games and AI-based games for interactive narratives, which is what this talk is about. And I don't do machine learning kind of AI. I am a pure symbolics person, pure rules-based. And also, I'm a playwright. I've had multiple shows produced, and arguably without writing plays and getting them produced, I wouldn't be doing the work that I'm currently doing. I wouldn't be designing the systems I currently am, any of it, because the theater production process is fascinating and I want to share it with you all. So to come back to what this talk is about, it is my attempt to answer the question, how do we make this kind of thing, i.e. character interaction, even more systemic and narrative feeling than what we currently do? And I also want to make sure this isn't seen as a dig against Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. It has some amazing systemic character things in it, especially the way that characters make first impressions of you. This talk is mostly like, I want more of that kind of thing. I want that to be a huge part of like the way that we can design character interactions. So my broadest possible answer, as you probably could guess, to this problem of how do we make more interesting character interaction is theater. So I want to talk first about sort of in general why we should be looking at theater as systemic game developers before talking more in depth about my approach to translating theater into game systems. So theater, if you're not familiar, is very playful by design in its approach, to the point that we call the works it produces plays. And when you work in theater or in a theatrical style, what you are ultimately doing is playing with characters, playing with the themes in a story, playing with moments, all of these things and more to make something new, even in a story that's been told for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So like, we still produce Shakespeare. We still retell Shakespeare. I am coming back from the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, where I have seen multiple versions of most of these plays at some point. Or thousands of years with Greek tragedy. Like, we're still making these, we're still producing them, we're still telling these stories, because there's always something you can find in them. And you might ask, okay, well, doesn't that mean, even with all that, even with being able to find these things, aren't scripts forcing structure and forcing a bunch of creative choices onto everyone else? And yes, but it's not as true as you might expect. Something, if you're a playwright, that you have to very deeply come to grips with pretty quickly is anything that you make is going to be unfinished. And there's never going to be a single universal version of your story, because the nature of theater is every single one of these productions is different, and it has to be, to make it relevant for the audience and relevant for the people at the time it is produced. And the production process is the thing that really finishes a play. And you finish a play by pulling at it, poking it, playing with all of its themes, what parts of it you want to highlight, how you want to play characters, and all of these other bits of stagecraft you can do to support the themes you want to highlight in the script. And again, this is why no two productions of the same play are ever the same, even if they take place in the same year, even with the same people involved, because everything about the production process is about trying new things and playing with what you have available to you. And so to sort of frame the first little section of this talk, I want to argue that theater is an analog human-powered generator of stories, and it's one that we've been iterating and refining for a few thousand years at this point. And the two components of the generator are your constraints, which are the play script and anything else the playwright will force you to do around the script, and your generative machinery that is working within those constraints to produce the final finished work of a play. Because how we tell these stories and how we tell stories in general matters just as much as what story we choose to tell and what the words we are saying are. And this is also how we can tell the same story in so many different ways and with such variation. And with this framing in mind, now we can start talking more in detail about acting, what it values, and sort of how you can be creative within even what appears to be very rigid constraints. And this last bit is what I really want to focus on with this talk. Because even if you have a story with, or a scene with no choices and it's entirely linear, that doesn't mean you can't have people find new things in it and find interactivity and find play within something that's linear. We do that all the time with levels in other kinds of games. Why can't we do that with storytelling? And so to sort of come back to what acting is about, this image right here is probably the single best example I have of summarizing what acting cares about. How you say something or do something can completely change the meaning of a line or a moment between characters. So all of these different versions of this line, all of these different line reads, have very different connotations and sort of say different things about the relationship between the speaker to who they're talking to, and give impressions about the state of the world, as it were. And to sort of return to my two Macbeths, that is a running theme of this talk. The words in these two versions of it are the same, and even like the core of each scene is, because, you know, if you're doing the scene, you have to do the scene. But there's so many small differences in here. Even things just like whether or not the three witches are touching Macbeth and whether or not he's cognizant of it at all. That all is going to change how much it feels like he's being manipulated versus finding things about himself by himself in sort of the way he approaches doing these terrible things leading to tragedy. And all of these smaller decisions about his relationship to the witches and how these scenes get played then informs the relationships he has to other characters, i.e. Lady Macbeth. And that will then change things like who of these two characters is the one really pushing for the horrible, tragic decisions to get made. In the top example, it's played a lot closer to Lady Macbeth is the one pushing everything forward. And in the bottom example, she might do a little bit of pushing, but it's ultimately him, Macbeth, making all of these choices and making the situation worse and worse constantly. But it's the same script, it's the same scenes, it's the same everything else. It's just how we're choosing to play things really can completely change the way the relationship works, and thus sort of the feel of the themes of the story. And as you read through a lot of performance practices from all over the world, and across even like different kinds of performance, at some point, one of them is going to say something about performance is about finding something new in the old and familiar. And they will sometimes talk about it exclusively as like a night to night thing of how do you keep yourself, the performer, invested in the story you're telling, because, you know, if you're bored, how are you going to convince the audience to not be bored? That sort of thing. But it also is applicable to different versions and different productions of the same play, because you have to answer the question, why are we doing this play now? So you always need to be finding something new or finding some different way of presenting or relating themes to perform a play, to make a play. You have to play with the play, as it were. And to come back up to my generator, my theater generator here, you take the constraints in the shape of the story with the script, but there's potentially an infinite number of versions of this story that can be told in different versions of the themes and different ways of playing all these characters, thanks to the production process and the inherent creativity of acting and performance. And what you can then view these scripts as are story volumes, which are, if you're not familiar, they're a term coined by Jason Greenblatt, and they are generative functions that produce storylines where their meaning isn't just contained in the storylines that they produce, but also the relationships between the storylines produced as a whole. So reading Macbeth by itself, reading the script, isn't sufficient to fully explore the nature of Macbeth, the story volume. And even seeing a single production will not get you a very clear picture of all the possibilities of Macbeth. So you need to keep trying new things and keep doing different things to better explore the story volume of a play. And this is how roguelikes, i.e. Caves of Cut here in this example, can be viewed as theater, and how a play like Macbeth can be viewed as a roguelike. When you play Cud, you're always playing Cud and you're always telling a story that is contained in Cud. And when you produce Macbeth, you're always telling Macbeth, and you're always doing something that is contained in the volume of these story worlds. But the reason we keep playing them again and again and again is because we want to find something new in the old. We want to find something new in that familiar space, and we want to fully explore the space of stories possible in the story volumes that are these different experiences. And all of this positioning hopefully has convinced you that theater is relevant to roguelikes and emergent narrative discussions. And the question now is, how do we make something with this? What do we do with it? And we need to dig a little bit deeper into what acting sees as its like primary vector for being creative and how it works, which is ultimately the how of a character, the how of a scene, the how of a story. How do we do this? How do we play with it? And back to my example about line reads, different ways of saying a line, different versions of playing with a line. Excuse me. That is all something under the purview of an actor and director, but this is one of the places you can really play with the meaning of a scene and play with the meaning of a character in the scene. And then another tool that is also related to the line read itself, the way that you say the line, is physicality. And using all of your movements and expressions to convey how a character feels in juxtaposition to the text of a script, in juxtaposition even with the line read you do. And all of these things put together can add a whole extra layer of texture and theming onto a character or a scene that they wouldn't otherwise have if you weren't carefully juxtaposing everything. And another important thing about juxtaposition is you need it there to help ground all this physicality into something more concrete, because without the text, without the lines, and even without some of the line readings, exactly what a gesture means can be very vague. And when it's not grounded by anything, you at that point are making vague gestures at nothing that's readable to your audience. So if acting is built on physicality, what does this mean for us as system designers and people who care about interacting with narrative in a systemic way? Well, when looking at the way dialogue scenes are made playable in many different games, it is often the case that the place we hand control over to our players is in what gets said, and everything else flows from that choice of what gets said. All the gestures, all the movements, all the expressions, everything that isn't exactly what gets said, down to the line readings. All of that flows off of what line gets chosen. And so there's a very, very tight coupling between the text and the lines of a scene and the reads and the gestures and the expressions that the characters perform. Which all of this is to say, there isn't very much play within a dialogue scene designed this way. There's only so many versions of this scene of these scenes that are possible. Because as many options as you write, each option only has one way of playing it, and you can read it differently, but there's a limit on that versus being able to play directly with the reads and the gestures and the expressions. So if we break the tight coupling between our dialogue lines and our reads and gestures and expressions, we suddenly have the freedom to play with the feel of a scene in a dimension we didn't before. And letting all of our different kinds of expression inform the way a line gets read and a line feels suddenly lets us have a whole new dimension of interactivity. And it helps us move from strictly role-playing in one sense to being able to fully act out a character and role-play them instead of being constrained in a very specific way. And there's a lot of ways you can do this decoupling work. I'm going to be talking about my approach for the last bit of this talk. So I am not saying this is the only way or the way that you have to do it. In fact, I would love people to try new versions of this, take what I'm saying in the rest of the talk and run with it. Because I like seeing new things, in case that wasn't obvious. So yeah, I'm going to talk about my whole process with this. And where I sort of started is the idea that any action a character can take in the game, in the world, should convey something additional beyond the basic like form and function of that action. And these actions can be anything. They don't have to be gestures, but for the sake of this talk, I will be mostly talking about them as gestures. So they need to convey something extra, some other expressive quality that other characters can then understand, interpret, and react to continue the scene and continue this sort of live interpretation. And we do have some existing examples of the way building your entire game around physicality and the way characters express physicality looks, and that's fighting games. And if you're not familiar, fighting games have this idea of frame data attached to every single action a character can take, which details all the different ways your attacks interact with another character, whether or not they hit them or you whiff or they block. All of that is contained in the frame data. And my sort of pitch here, in the way that I approach doing this, is rather than using that sort of markup of animations and physicality to express how dangerous something is, when it becomes dangerous, what happens if it connects, what happens if it blocks or is blocked, that sort of thing. What if instead we attached an expression of emotional affect to these gestures and actions that then allow you to have specific emotions conveyed by gestures, which then inform what your other character perceives you as, and then they can make choices about the way they act based on what they see you doing. And ultimately, the goal here is building a language of physicality. And ultimately this is also what I want to encourage you all to do, is create a small language that your human and AI characters can use to communicate at a similar level to each other at. So the example I'm using here is having a set of actions available for one character. So they can point in a couple different ways. They can point aggressively or lazily, or they can shrug nonchalantly or shrug dismissively. And these all convey certain things about how this is how the character would want to convey something about them, about the way they are feeling. So they pick something to do. In this case, it's shrug nonchalantly. And then our other characters will now respond and react and think about what this first character is doing based on sort of their relationships, their opinions, their read of the situation, any kind of information you want to factor in. So if they like character 0, so character 1 apparently likes character 0, they generally agree with the fact that that being nonchalant and chill is fine, so they'll do something back that reflects that. In this case, shrug nonchalantly. And character 2 in this situation will see character 0 being nonchalant and go, this ain't the time for that. This is a more formal occasion. Point aggressively at them and go, let's say, you need to shape up, buddy, or something like that. So to wrap up, after my example there, acting and having this sort of language for characters is ultimately about trying to, again, find something new in the old and get fresh perspectives on stories and themes and even like parts of stories in ways that you might not expect. And we can encourage our players to do this and encourage ourselves to allow this to happen more organically by decoupling our line reads and gestures and expressions from our dialogue to then let players play with those elements and do their own reads on characters, perform their characters in their own unique ways, and find things that we as designers may never have thought of. And we can do this using what I was just talking about, by building a language of physicality where your actions you can take convey certain things and can then be interpreted by your fellow characters to produce a new version of a scene or bounce off of each other in a way that you might not expect. And again, hopefully find something new. So that is my talk. Thank you all for coming and listening. If you're curious about like the nitty-gritty details of the technical way that I've worked on this idea, I am happy to answer questions about that. I am happy to talk about the like specific design aspects of it that I didn't go into in this talk. And I can do that here, offline, whenever. If you are interested in more of what I do, my personal site is the first link there. If you want to see some of my published games, my itch page is the second link there. And if you want to look at the code base for the acting system I built, which I was talking in a very high level about, that is the last link there. And you can find me on all of the different social media platforms, co-host, Blue Sky, Twitter, Mastodon, all of those at Quakeful Tales. All right, everybody. Thanks again. And I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.
All right. Well, that was wonderful. Very exciting. And we have, I think, most got problems sort of kind of worked out. So we are taking some questions, and I believe that Nic is here to join us for a bit of Q&A. I know that you're traveling, so we were using a mix of recorded and live. Do we have Nic Kawa? Any minute now. Okay, you want to bring Nic on? And we'll get into a bit of Q&A, which could be just audio, if that's what works. Excellent. Hooray! Hi, Nick.
Hey, oh, hang on. For some reason, I can't hear.
Oh, okay. I'm just going to keep talking so it's easier for you to tell when it's fixed. And yes, for people in the stream, it should be working better now in the social space. You should be able to refresh if it's too quiet and hopefully hear chat. How's it, Nick? Oh, okay. Now I can't hear you. Maybe you can hear me. We're working on it. If nothing else, we will have the social space. But we have a little bit. We have 5 minutes here to work things out. We're working through it. Yeah. I'm going to pontificate about some things from the chat while you figure it out. If you figure out what's up with your mic, feel free to just interrupt me and start talking. I know that one question that came up that then got answered in the chat was about the different ways to do kind of expression and gesture in things like text-based. And so you were bringing up some points there about using different elements of typography, like, you know, the kerning, the bold, the italics, the different kind of things with text, which I think is interesting to get into how that works in different kind of mediums and how that's built into some things like RenPy. Oh, I heard something. Is it working better? Maybe you can't hear us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, there we go. It was just
Wonderful.
Stream decided to use different audio.
That's totally fine. We've got a few minutes. We finally made it. Excellent talk. Thank you very much for taking part and dealing with our technical challenges today. I'll get right into a question. So Hillext asked, what techniques from theater haven't made their way into the roguelike or game design space yet? And presumably, what are some ones that you think would be interesting to bring into those spaces?
So I mean, obviously I talked about acting in this, and part of the reason I did is a lot of acting stuff hasn't quite made it in. But then even stuff like directing and the way that you can like play with a scene at a high level as a director, it's like figuring out sort of the general tone of a scene, sort of the themes present in a scene, and like playing with those beyond like I am a character that's embodied. So that's one of them. And then I mean, like I said, I'm a playwright. Doing things like it's kind of hard to be a playwright in a game, but so I'll be academic for a minute and
You'd be as academic as
Aristotle,
you want.
who I have
I
many
love it.
problems with, he has a thing about playwrights shouldn't do anything new. They should just like remix whatever they're doing. And so you could almost argue like hypertext is sort of that style of, we have this authored thing and you are moving around it and changing the way you're experiencing it, like as a viewer. And that's sort of like what he talks about in terms of like what a playwright's job is.
Yeah, I
There's
think that
also
the
some
idea
stuff
of even
with like lighting design, because you can do a lot with like mood and that's another job I've done. So I'm more familiar with like, oh, you can play around with.
Yeah. The question of like interpretation and being more aware of, how are people interpreting this and trying to encourage them to interpret in different ways. Like that's something interesting to me. I feel like I haven't seen come up as often in how we talk about game design.
Yeah, and so I've talked a little bit about the game project that I've been working on for a while as part of my research and being an independent game developer. And I've described this in my MFA as something that was too close to fighting games in terms of how successfully it captured like that aesthetic. And part of the reason I said that was because it's a game that requires a lot of interpretation and legwork on the player's part to like figure out, do you like the performance? Do you like the way a scene feels? Do you agree with like what you were doing with the text? That's a lot of like dramaturgical stuff that is very hard to do if you don't have any training. So different kind of difficulty than fighting games, but sort of that similar feel.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there's been lots of discussion in chat. I think that someone said like this is the kind of talk that they will be coming back to in the recording to really dig into, since there's a lot of interesting ideas. I think it's thank you so much for joining and getting a few questions in there. So I was glad we were able to make a little bit of a Q&A work, and hopefully I know you were around in the social space chat, so people who are interested in talking more in the breakout room can do that after our final talk of the day, which is coming up now. So excellent. All right, moving on, and just as the quick aside in between, like I've said, the social space should be in a better state now. We figured out what was causing our biggest issue. We fixed it, which in the process of doing so blew up the whole space for a little bit, but it should be back now. Still obviously not perfect, but if you're seeing no messages at all, especially in the theater where there's some chatting going on, you can try refreshing it. Hopefully that helps. I know that the other organizers are behind the scenes working away to try and figure out any other ways to improve that. I finally see people talking, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for the stress testing. We really appreciate it. Better to have things a little rough here than at the main event when we've got 2 straight days of this. So without further ado, we're going to move on to our last but not least discussion of the day. Oh, and also do make sure you only have the social space open in one tab. Apparently, if you are doing it in multiple tabs, it might cause some problems. If you need to pop out the stream itself, there's a button to just like pop out the stream, or you can open the YouTube or the Twitch stream. But ideally keep the social space just in one tab is word that I'm getting. Anyway, hello, actual introductions. Thank you for your patience. Yes, welcoming now Aron and Michael of Airmite Games, 2 co-founders, studio behind the roguelike city builder Against the Storm. So do some proper introductions here. Aron is a co-founder and is the producer of Against the Storm. His previous work on Dying Light 2 and Dying Light Bad Blood taught him how to create scalable products which benefit the early access growth of Against the Storm. When not making games, he's playing with his puppies, Hector and Pietroń, and relentlessly trying to convince Michael that Gothic is a better game than Morrowind, which I had to include just for the hot take. And Michael, another co-founder of Airmite Games and the lead developer and designer of Against the Storm, he puts his past experiences working on live service games into practice by releasing new Against the Storm content updates every 2 weeks, which is very fast. So,
thank you for having us tonight. Hello from across the Atlantic.
Hello. Yes, it's always wonderful when we can get people from a little further away than the usual San Francisco locale. So thank you for working with our time zones.
It's been fun. Hi. We've played some games before hopping on the stream, so we had a long night.
Excellent. Well, yeah, like to get into it, I think that maybe actually, hopefully people have played Against the Storm, but if not, if you want to maybe talk a little bit about it, and especially I think the most interesting thing to us is that roguelite city builder connection and how you got to that combination, which I think is an interesting one and one that works extremely well. I've played a lot of Against the Storm in the last week, I'll tell you that.
So maybe Aron can kick off and talk a bit about Against the Storm itself, and I can continue with the roguelike elements.
Yeah, let's go with that. So for those of you who haven't played Against the Storm, it's a game of that takes the city builder core of all the mechanics of all the player actions basically, and spices them up with roguelike elements. So when we designed Against the Storm from the beginning, we tried to like distill the essence of a city builder of the beginning 1 to 2 hours of a gameplay loop in a city builder, and add replayability to it. So we focused mostly on the replayability side, on the generation side of roguelites, and we took those elements, implemented them into the game. The game is out from on Steam right now. It's been almost 2 years of early access, bi-weekly updates, a lot of player feedback there. And so the game is evolving still. That's being a roguelite is very helpful in that, because we change the balance here and there. The game is heavily reliant on RNG, of course. So tuning that and giving players new content results in basically a lot of replayability. One of the main, I think, draws to the game is we have like a perk system. We have blueprints for buildings which are generated. So you never play the same hand. You have something of a random, pseudo-random hand you're dealt, and you have to find ways of playing with it, basically. And the game is like cut in some smaller like sessions where you build a city for 2 hours, then you move on to the world map where you find another way to settle somewhere, and you start this loop again. Of course, the game is progressively getting harder the more you play, and there's also the roguelite element comes into play. So that's why we call it roguelite, because we have some permanent progression there you can buy in the smoldering city, so the main city of the big of the game, basically. I don't know if you, Michael, want to add something to the roguelike element here.
Sure. So I think you heard this discussion like many times, but just to be sure, for us, like when we thought about it initially, the roguelite is more of a RPG elements. It's the same basically. So you can have Ubisoft game with RPG elements. You can have a farming game with RPG elements. So we thought we could capture the same feeling with roguelite. So we've built a very simple prototype of a simple city builder, and then we thought, okay, if a roguelite is just like an element of RPG, how does it manifest? What does it mean for a game to be a roguelite? Like what do we need? So we identified few elements. For example, the most important for us was the power fantasy. Ultimate power fantasy. This ability that is purely found in roguelite and roguelikes, that you can you play to find this one magical build one time out of 20 and absolutely break the game. And in any other genre, it would be unacceptable. It would be bad balance. It would be boring and one strategy to just play. But in this one magical genre, it's actually what we do. So that was one of the elements, the decisions and the meaningful repercussions of those decisions was very important to us. And also the cycle. The roguelites have very unique beats about them. You can play them for 2 hours and leave them, return after 2 weeks, play 8 hours, like 4 rounds or whatever, and then leave the game for another month. And we really enjoyed that, and we thought it's a great thing to find way into city builder genre, which is great. We love it, but we thought that it can breathe a bit life to the genre that is getting a bit stalled, maybe. And it was much easier to think that way, that hey, those are the elements, those are like flavors, and let's put it into a city builder.
Yeah, that's really interesting in the way that with roguelites you can push, what a really good combination looks like, and also what a really bad combination looks like. Because worst case, you're going to fail that run, but like there'll be another one right after. Which, yeah, that's interesting in comparison to. I like how, especially, I find that the beginning of a game of a city builder, often you end up with kind of a pattern that you do every single time because that's kind of optimal.
True.
But there's so many additional conditions that change in Against the Storm because of those roguelite elements that will make you, push what you do, and you have to kind of like re-strategize every time.
To be honest, that was the largest challenge, and that is something that we still a bit struggle with. Like almost every change we implement to the game was measured in a way. Does it help replayability? Does it make run differ between each other? And if the feature didn't make the game different, even if it was fantastic, in most cases we didn't go for it, and we thought very hard about what could make players play differently, basically. Because that's something that, as you mentioned, it's not it's quite unique in city builder genre.
Yeah, were there any examples where you found something that seemed like a good idea but then didn't help with that replayability? Like how do you test that? Do you just think through, or is that one where the speed of your updates helps of kind of seeing how the community plays with the new update? Do you ever take things out if it's not impacting replayability like you'd hoped?
To be honest, there are like multiple steps. The first one is the designer and his head. And to be honest, there are many ideas that we as designers think are great, but then when we sleep with it and look at the screen on another day, we can clearly see it's a bad idea. The second filter is the team itself. Like we are really believing in the democratized process, if I can say that. Like we all decide if the feature is worth it or not, and there are multiple occasions. For example, I can give an example from, I don't know, like last month, that I thought about a great system like cities having walls, because walls look fantastic and they would breathe a lot of life to the game. But on the very first stage, I almost like, I don't think that will make, like in every game, players will feel obliged to do it, and every town will look the same, and there will be just another action that you have to complete in every game. And to be honest, that was enough, like, because he was right. If we would add such an overwhelmingly impactful system to the game, it would be repeated in every game and would defeat the purpose. But also, as you said, the next filter is the players themselves. I don't think there are many occasions where we cut the feature entirely, but there are like multiple examples of features that we iterated like 3 or 4 times before we settled on a version that both we and the players enjoyed and thought it helped their playability. I don't know if Aron can think about some good example.
I'm not sure about an example, but I think that even if we focus very heavily on creating replayability and creating different experiences between different runs, we still have some small actions in the game or some points where it's unavoidable to an extent. Like in an action game, in a turn-based game, those actions are so small that you don't really notice them. in a city builder, your basic actions are a lot longer, and their time span is longer. So for example, in our game, most sessions start with you build up some roads for your city, you build up a woodcutters camp, you build up some gathering camps. So these are the basic actions that basically happen every time. Sometimes you do them in a different order, but most of the time they are still the same. So it's always a bit of that repeated action always there. But also, I think that when Michael was talking about the last filter, which are the players, basically, one very good tool we're using for filtering those repeatable and not so interesting mechanics is that we do an experimental branch a lot of the time for our game. So we do like bi-weekly updates, but when we have something controversial to add to the game, like something that might not really be, we are not sure ourselves if it's the best idea. We just give the most dedicated players access to a beta branch, basically, and they can test they can test the new feature and give us feedback. And we always ask like pointed questions in those beta stages. So we ask, one of the most important questions there is always like, how does this feature or this change influence the gameplay overall? Is the gameplay more boring or repeatable, or is it more interesting? I can't think of any other like big features that we cut lately, because there's been a lot of features.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's I think that's all we can think of on that topic.
Yeah, and then it's interesting that, element of getting information from the community. Travis asks, what kind of metrics do you collect? Do you get things like the average game time from players, like what difficulty they're on, like what kind of information have you found helpful to collect there?
Our background is actually like mobile games, so we are a bit skewed
Yeah.
in that sense, and we really enjoy gathering, of course, anonymous analytics, like gameplay analytics, and going through it like basically every 2 weeks in some form. But of course, that's only a small part of the picture. Like, there are so many occasions in which the data is pointing into one direction. Even like the simplest examples, like having 30 perks, and you look at the percentage of perks being picked. Even that is like, looking just at the numbers, it can be very misleading, because very often the most interesting and beloved perks are also the most situational, and they won't be picked that often, and they are completely fine, and we don't want to change them. But looking at the numbers themselves, you could say, oh, okay, here's the most boring perk ever made, and it's the most picked. We actually have this one, it's like 50% to woodcutting speed, and it's horrible, but we just can't convince the community that it's not, and just they're always in the top. So yeah, we gather a lot of analytics, but we don't go blindly into it. We really read the feedback on all the channels we can put our hands on. Maybe those days, nowadays, we don't have that much time, and sometimes we miss a thing or two, but we really focus on that. And I think it's crucial for our like process. Aron probably can summarize it better.
Yeah, I mean, with analytics, we have like the most basic ones for like the perks people choose, the buildings they choose, because this is also generated. The basic actions they take in a game, the events they encounter, how do they solve them. So these are like, as Michael said, on one hand, it's helping us create a good balanced background. So for example, because those spiky perks, as Michael said, are the most interesting ones, but they have to be juxtaposed to a like a background where stuff is relatively for this game balanced. So that helps us with that. There's also like the issue of scale a bit, because before you have a game released, it's hard to get feedback because nobody really cares about the game. When you have the game released now and people are playing it daily, then the feedback is almost overwhelming to a degree. And it's also, aside from just picking the right feedback from the analytics, we also monitor the like YouTube channels, Discord messages, Reddit, Steam forums, and so on. And it's also some, like, our duty is to basically read everything, but we also have to correctly filter it, because between the lines, between the feedback, there's a lot of feedback that is saying something else that is written. For example, people wanting some perks or some abilities or anything to be more powerful doesn't really mean that something is like not is too weak or is not really fun. Sometimes it's just because that's their favorite playstyle and they want to be like have even more power fantasy tied to it. So we have to be careful with that. I have this problem where I try to reactively change some stuff in the game because, you know, when there's player feedback, there has to be something wrong, but that's not always the case. So I think we slowed down with the feedback a bit because of the scale, but also because of the scale, the feedback in the sea of feedback, you can see the points more clearly because no, the best thing about, for example, balance is always if people talk about the balance thing from both sides and they argue, it's a good position to be in, because if they argue, then there's no clear answer, and that's a fun thing to witness, because, you know, talking about balance is something we as gamers enjoy.
Yes, that's a great point. And yeah, I mean, I've heard the advice before that, you know, when someone says they have a problem, usually that's always true. But when they say, and here's the solution, that's when, you know, you need to kind of take a minute and think about if that's actually the best solution.
Yeah, we also use like this, use a special site, for example, in early access called Upvote, where people can post like their feature requests, their balance requests, and so on. It's a very good tool to like collect upvotes for different like feature requests from players, but it's also a tool where you have to be careful with the solutions, as you said, because people offer a lot of solutions for things that they think that should change in the game, but a lot of the time the solutions are somewhere else. It's not that this perk, for example, is weak. It's maybe that this playstyle is not really well defined, and it should have more definition before we change the perks that are tied to it, and so on and so on. So it's always a bit of a guessing game, and also a bit of a reading between the lines.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
I like that you. Oh, go ahead.
No, it just I just wanted to add that maybe I'm a bit, or we are a bit freaked out about player feedback, but we always thought and talked about players have the full right, in our opinion, to write convoluted feedback, to write emotional feedback, to write just bluntly wrong feedback, to whatever. It's like it's not their job to give like perfect informed and design a very well thought feedback, because we really believe that that's something that the designer is responsible for. Like, we need to look at this sometimes emotional ranting, right? Especially in games like ours, when there's like the stakes can be high, right? It's like there is no loading back, and so people can get a bit emotional. They can rant a bit sometimes. I must admit, we have our community is great. It's not like League of Legends or something. I love LoL, but yeah, we all know it. But I think, and I truly believe that it's our job as designers to unpack it, to really get to the bottom of the feedback.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to ask, because I think, again, Aaron, you mentioned at one point the need to resist the urge to get too caught up in the feedback and kind of be reactive. Like, have you found any good techniques to help? Especially there's sometimes that like emotional toll if you're hearing a lot of really emotionally charged feedback? How do you take that in a way that stops you from being too reactive or just getting too stressed out, or like it's a lot of work. It can be very overwhelming, especially negative or emotional feedback.
Probably the best advice is waiting like 2 weeks. Really,
It's
because
time.
there are multiple occasions when people are like, "Oh, it's horrible, we're gonna kill you" or something. But after a week or two, people just get used to it, and not in a bad way. In like, oh yeah, it's horrible, but now I can live with that. More like after they play with it a bit with it, they find a way to how to basically implement it into their playstyle, for example, right? To use this perk, to use this mechanic, to basically win with it, or just find a niche for it, right? And in many cases, that's the time is the factor we need.
Yeah, because of the time, we can judge if this change was influencing the playstyle in a good way, because we want to sometimes disrupt the player's playstyle a bit, especially if the game has such a long lifetime, or if it's just a bad design idea and then people universally hate it after like a week or two. I think the other tool that is very useful, it's not very useful for solo devs, but for a team it's very useful. We basically talk about it a lot. And for example, I am a bit more reactive, but Michael is a bit more level-headed. So we find common grounds there when it comes to addressing feedback. For example, Luke, our community manager, is very player-centered. So even if we have an urge to dismiss some piece of feedback, because not dismiss, but like say, okay, let's wait with that, it's gonna be fine in 2 days, we still have like this itch from the team to, okay, let's respond to that, let's take it into consideration, let's mix it in with the other feedback we have somewhere written down. So basically being in a team of different individuals is helping with that, with coping with the feedback, especially with the emotional one. When somebody takes some emotional feedback too serious and too hard, then the rest can console them a bit.
That's great. Yeah, a benefit to being on a team. Another question. So you mentioned a couple of times the kind of longer cycle, which is something I found interesting too, is that a city builder, even with the way it's broken out into runs, kind of has like a longer feel to it often than a typical roguelite does. I'm curious how some of that came into it. And then even Travis asked a question about the Queen's Impatience bar as something that mechanically kind of at a certain point forces the player's speed of you kind of got to end up, completing by a certain time. Was that kind of a thematic choice? Was that coming from mechanically needing a way to limit how long a run is? Like, how do you think about that kind of the time a run takes, especially when you bring in those roguelite elements, which are usually a little faster?
So I think very early in the project, we were thinking about how long the session could possibly be, and very quickly we came to the like hour and a half and 2 hours. So we were always designing the game to be so the runs would be that long, and every major positive change was always balanced by some negative ones that make the game shorter or longer. But the Queen's Impatience actually it's quite for us it was very very important moment in the project, because at the beginning we've published a demo on Steam. It was, I don't know, like 3 years ago, basically 1 year into the production. The game was in a really rough state, I would say. It was like playable, people had fun with it, but it was very simplistic. And the Queen's Impatience was basically a timer. Like nowadays, it's more of a resource. You can stretch it, you can reduce it, you can increase it. There are some benefits to having it. But back in the days, it was like 30 minutes timer or 1 hour timer. And it's horrible. It's like one of the worst mechanics in a game. People should be upset about it. It's just all, we didn't have time to implement anything like more interesting. because racing city builder, when you race with time, it doesn't really sound that funny. But we've put like a very simple fantasy, like flavor, taste on it. It's a queen, and she's very angry, very impatient, and it just matches the expectations, right? You can see her. And I remember watching some, like one of the very first stream that someone posted on YouTube, and he was screaming at the scream like, "Queen, please!" He was like, "The bar is almost there," and she's like, "Oh no, she's so angry." And I knew it's like 24 minutes out of 25. It's like there is absolutely nothing there, like behind this like thin layer of fiction. But it was enough for players. It was enough, and I remember I was stunned by like how much one can achieve with just a thin layer of fiction that just matches the expectation, right? Because if that would be, I don't know, some.
Oh, we lost Michael.
Oh, we lost Michael.
He's logging in
The
back in, but
the queen
yeah,
was
the
like,
queen just
nope.
cut him off because he was saying bad stuff about her. No, but we even had some early problems with that. Oh, hello. I can hear myself.
Sorry.
We even had some early problems with that when we first pitched the idea to some publishers. We talked about some feedback from outside the team in the early days, even before the demo. We encountered an issue with from the very beginning that this is just a timer, and that some people even today, when they buy the game on Steam and play it like they would a normal city builder, they still feel like this is the expectation. They want to play a longer game. They don't want to be rushed. But that's a moment where I think we managed to create, as Michael said, a more of a resource out of it. Like it's decreased because you gain reputation. You have some perks that play off of that. Sometimes you even want more impatience because it lowers the hostility of the forest and so on. So it's now more of a mechanic than just a timer. But even to this day, there's some people who don't really like that. But that's, I think, something that we want to really address because the game has an identity right now. It's a roguelike city builder. So that's one of the elements, and some pressure there. There has to be some pressure, basically. But sorry, I just further content because you dropped.
No, you're doing great. The only thing I would add is that we quickly noticed that on the other hand, we also like there is a negative thing that is like controlling how long can you play, but also there is a positive thing. Like when you're doing great, when every species is very happy, the game also is done, like it's completed very quickly, like a minute or two, and it's gone. And it's also very like intentional decision because we don't want the player to be satisfied for too long. It's like playing like it's very, I would say, normal in roguelites. Like if you're having a perfect build in Risk of Rain, you're just gonna absolutely demolish every boss that you encounter and win the game even faster than you would do normally. And that's great, but the game cannot give you too much with this power fantasy. Otherwise, you will just get bored with a regular game. It's like a very thin ice, I would say. We need to step on as a roguelite designers. So it's like controlled on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it's nice everything comes back to this kind of variability in roguelites of, you know, things can go really well, things can go really poorly, and that gives it that freshness. Yeah, I know we're coming up close on the end of time already. I will end on, I think, a question that can be a lot of fun, especially for these kind of swingy games of just like, are there any particular favorite fun stories you've had, either, you know, seeing people achieve combinations in the game you didn't expect, or if, you know, when you were testing things you had an idea that when you went into it created some situation that was unexpected, like some favorite moments.
I mean, we routinely get screenshots from players when they like break a record in resource gathering, because that's one of the measures of success in City Builder, where you can I mean, basically your economy is your like power measure in the game a bit. So we routinely get some screenshots where somebody has like 50,000 meat, and there are some perks they use to get to that, because we have some perks that the more you produce, the more you gain in the next production cycle. Plus, you get meat when somebody dies. Plus, you get a perk that doesn't increase the queen's impatience, because normally the queen's impatience grows when somebody dies in your village. So they have a perk that disables that gives them meat if somebody dies. They specifically trigger some like events, hostile events, just to like starve or kill people off and just gather more resources. But I can't think of anything more crazy than that lately. I don't know if you, Michael, have any.
There was this one thing we had an event called Living Matter, and it was an event that was slowly chewing through your food, but and if you wouldn't solve it, it would like duplicate and stay on the map. So now we have 2, and they will duplicate to 4. And we thought like, hey, it's a great event. Well, if you want to solve it, and it had some really good rewards, like you could, and they were random, so you could farm it. But you had to be like very careful, right? If you like, our idea was that, yeah, you can farm it, right? You can have like 2 or 4 of them, but if you forget about them or you won't have resources to fix them, everything will spiral out of control and destroy your village, right? Wonderful design, great idea. But the players, of course, found a way to stop it, and they were building like those small fences around 4 of them. So and they were like creating a small farm fields of living matter, just because we wanted to be cool, and the event was avoiding any buildings or structures, so not to destroy anything. And the players were using it to farm the living matter for like the entirety of the game.
Yeah, because you could basically just enclose it in a small fence. The game would then say, okay, I don't have space to duplicate, so I'm going to stay here. And they just use that to create like an enclosure for the living matter. Yeah.
Now, did you just decide to leave it that way and you're like, good job? Or did you
No.
it's a fix that was a little too
It destroys buildings now.
Yeah, we were nasty.
I love, only in roguelikes can you get away with having those exponential, every time you do this happens, and the loops. But yeah, they can go too far. But well, excellent. I know we gave a little bit of extra time because we started late, but we should let you go. Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful to have you here. Like I said, it's great when we can have people from the other side of the ocean, and I'm excited, for more people, hopefully in the roguelike community, if they didn't already know about Against the Storm, to try it out, because I think that the roguelite city builder concept just works so well. And it's great to see the game keeps changing so quickly that there's always new stuff to check out.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll keep updating the game. Probably this year, at the end of the year, it's going to be out of early access. So it's going to be a bit less chaotic balance-wise. You don't have to relearn it every 2 weeks, maybe. We'll see about that. It's going to be fun. Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, it was great talking with you.
Cool. I'm glad. Well, good luck with the early access release, and hopefully we'll see you for a bit of the main event. And thank you so much for coming to the event.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. That brings us to the end of the content programming for the preview event. Thank you so much, everyone who came here and soldiered through our technical issues. I think we got there in the end, and we had some great speakers. I'm glad all of them made the time for this, since the speakers are really where I think you get a lot of the good stuff from Roguelike Celebration. So hopefully that was enjoyable. I know that there was a little bit of discussion in chat, especially once we got it working, which was really good to see. Thank you, everyone who submitted questions either before or during. And at this point, we are going to keep the space open for a little while longer so that there is time to explore and also time to have some follow-up discussions. So the way that's going to work is that we are going to now assign all of the different talks to a different breakout room. These are accessible from the theater in the space. So if you want to talk about Diablo and David Brevik's talk, please visit I Was a Teenage Gelatinous Cube. If you want to talk about Nic Junius's talk on stage influences in dynamic and character acting, then head to Jabberwock Park. And if you want to talk about Against the Storm and the fireside chat we just had, head to Attack of the 50-Foot Goblin. So again, Gelatinous Cube for Diablo and David Brevik, Attack of the 50-Foot Goblin for Against the Storm, and Jabberwock Park for Nic's talk on characters and stage and theater and dynamic kind of character acting. So we're going to keep the space open for at least 30 minutes, maybe more. We will do a shout in this space when we are going to be closing it so that you get your warning and can say your goodbyes. That sounded ominous. Just goodbye for now. We'll be back in a month and a bit for the main event on October 21st and 22nd. Again, you can get tickets for that now at roguelike.club. And you can see all of the great talks that we're going to have there. Any other announcements that we have in the space will be shouting through the chat because I am about to sign off from this video stream. But we want to thank everyone again for coming. I want to thank Maggie again for captioning. It's always wonderful to have that. To all of our speakers and volunteers who actually made this happen, including the volunteers behind the scenes trying to fix the social space while we were live. Thank you. I think that in the end we got there, which is great. And reminder that if you have any kind of big bugs, or just generally if you have any issues that you want to talk to a moderator about, you can always type /mod, M-O-D, and that will send us a message. And if you have general feedback on the social space or on today's event, then head to the feedback kiosk and you can leave a note there. It's near the fountain. So enjoy your time in the space. Feel free to mingle, explore, do some breakouts, and I'm going to be signing off from the broadcast. Thank you very much for being here, and I hope to see all of you again next month. Goodbye.